So over the last 3 weeks, one of the things that I've been trying to demonstrate to you is to move away from the narrative of good ulama, bad ulama, strong ulama, weak ulama, ulama versus Abdul Hamid II, ulama for Abdul Hamid II, and so forth, and trying to understand the complexity of the devlet and the complexity of the role of the ulama during what we would call the modernization process. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things that I mentioned to you last week was the idea that the word modernity is a little bit strange because we now have created theories around it. But in actuality, when you try to scrutinize it a bit tighter, what does modernity mean, right? Does modernity mean westernization? Is modernity independent from westernization? If modernity is independent from westernization, does it still mean it's independent from Eurocentric narratives? If it is independent from Eurocentric narratives, can we have alternative modernities? Can we have an Ottoman modernity? And can we have multiple modernities within the Ottoman domains, right? So now you start to realize that the idea of modernity here now becomes challenging because what is it that's being asked from the student when trying to make sense of what modernity is? We have a huge movement called the decolonial movement, or the movement of decoloniality in that sense. Is it possible that we can have a demodernization movement? Is that what we're asking for? When we're asking for decolonialism, are we asking for a demodernization? And there are works that we see by certain peoples and scholars who write about demodernization. The idea that the revolution in Iran in 1979 was a movement towards demodernization. Or in Afghanistan, the emergence of the Taliban in particular is a movement towards demodernization. But the only way you can make these assumptions that the 79 revolution in Iran or the Taliban in Afghanistan are a movement towards demodernization is you have to have an idea of what is modernization. Inherently, what's interesting about the idea of being a demodernizer is still something which is inherently Islamic. The suggestion that people who are of an Islamic inclination, especially people of a religious background, are of the reflection of wanting to demodernize. Now, when we look at Halak's idea of, like I said before, about the impossible state in modernization, to some degree, you get led down a direction with the assumption that modernity is, the only way to remove modernity is absolute anarchy. There is no, we can't envisage what will be after modernity. And that's a challenge. This is why I was trying to explain to you that the idea of empire is a little bit more helpful, even though Muslims don't like using the word empire, but here in the English medium I'm using it, is a little bit more helpful than the term modernity, because then you can say that human beings, when they did their politics, configured in empire. Then came the nation state, which could be what we could say an interregnum. And then, because the nation state is quite unnatural regarding the way that human beings have done governance from the beginning of time, that in actuality empire, it's not that we're going to see a return of empire, it's the fact that empire hasn't left us. And so this hierarchy that's created, as I said to you before, whether it's Turkey thinking it's an empire because of its Ottoman past or Byzantine past, the Americans thinking they're empire, the Chinese thinking they're empire, the Russians thinking they're empire, what you see is that states which are stronger will move away from the nation-state model because of the assumption that the nation-state as an idea is restrictive. And that is something that you can work with. You can make the argument, rather than saying we're going to modernize, continue to modernize and fall apart, or we turn around and say we need to demodernize, what in actuality you may say is the argument that we were in a realm of empires, we then went into the realm of nation states, and the chances are is other states will return back to an imagination of empire once again. Okay, this configuration. In this sense, Islam and Muslims and the ulama have always functioned traditionally under this framework of empire. This is why I'm putting this on the table. When you look at, I was speaking to Sami Ayub, a friend of mine who's an academic, some of you may know him, and he made the argument that the Sharia, the function of the Sharia, is far more applicable to the configuration of empire than it is to the configuration of the nation state. He didn't say the Sharia is not functional in the framework of modernity, because that in itself is problematic. It gives the argument that here the Sharia just has no role at all in the modern life that we live in. But the argument he was making is that it's far more applicable to the way that empire configures. A lot of people, when you speak to them who are part of Islamist movements, and I don't like using that word, but I'm using this loosely here just because it's become the norm, they will talk about the idea that no khilafah, no sharia, or no khalifa, no sharia. This is the traditional position they've held continuously throughout Islamic history. And that's because the position of the authority, which is the khalifa, has always been subjected to violence, aggression, and removal, and so forth. What they have never spoken of is no ulama, no sharia, which is intriguing. The position of the Khalifa has become synonymous with the idea of Sharia regarding the implementation of the Sharia. But the conversations have never been had about, can you implement the Sharia without the ulama? Okay? And this is interesting because while there is fiqhi works regarding the position of the leader, there has never been a need to write fiqhi works on the position of the ulama because they have existed from the beginning. It's just a smooth transition in that sense. They've always maintained. There's always going to be people within the community who are going to be upholders of the tradition in that sense, because ilm is a fundamental component of the Muslim identity. Now, one of the interesting things that you see in Ottoman studies is try to make a distinction between Ottomanism, Islamism, and Turkification. And they would argue that the Ottoman identity is a secular identity. I would argue that Ottomanism is not secular. Ottomanism is Islamicate. And that's something else now that I'm positing here. To make the argument that Ottomanism as a concept is Islamicate, and if we say it's Islamicate, as a result of it, it's able to incorporate non-Muslims within its worldview. It's able to incorporate Christians, Jews, and so forth within its worldview. Then it should not come as a surprise if non-Muslims were in the state administration. And that when they're talking about Ottomanism, when the ulama are talking about it, they're talking about it from a Muslim perspective. And when non-Muslims are part of it, they understand that you can be a non-Muslim and still live under the domains of a Muslim empire and still be part of the configuration of whatever that ummah is in that context. And this is what you're seeing in the Ottoman context. The idea of the ummah of Islam, but then making the general case of ummah of people who live under the domains of Islam. There's a difference here, right? So what I'm saying is you're starting to see the nuance of language in this period. Now, the reason why I'm trying to make this case for you is because what's interesting about the ulama is the ulama's identity was not only synonymous with the implementation of Sharia as a general concept, but they were synonymous with the notion of ummah. Okay, the idea of ummah and the ulama go hand in hand. The ummah without the ulama cannot be ummah. In that context, it's an argument that you can put forward. How can this independence be possible? Because the ulama are part of the ummah. What makes the configuration of the ummah is that there are people within it that regulate this community from the perspective of Islam. And without it, how can you call it that? So this is another point that needs to be made here in that sense. Whereas the position of the Khalifa is a little bit different. Now, once again, I guess what I'm positing here is the idea that how do you make sense of what the ulama are? And as I said, ummah is a plural word and ulama is plural, because the way that religions operate, we're communitarian. So we don't see the ulama as individuals in this sense. And we have become victims of that today. Al-Ghazali said, Taymiyyah said, Ghazali versus Taymiyyah. It's this culture of individualism. But in actuality, when you see the way that the ulama was studying, the ulama said, these members of the ulama had these positions, and those members of the ulama had the other position. It was the collective, and it was a plurality within the collective that it was understood that this community is seen as a community as a whole, not as a sum of individuals in the way we understand ourselves in Western society, in that sense. So what we see in the 19th century and 20th century then regarding what we would call modernity is an intellectual challenge. And one of the things I want to make it very clear is I'm not trying to swing the pendulum the other way to say that the ulama were the most important thing in the Ottoman domains. This is what a lot of secular academics get defensive about and start attacking me on. When I try to make the case that the ulama were important, they seem to assume that I'm making the case that they were more important than everyone else. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they were just as important as everyone else. Okay? And in that sense, they need to be incorporated in the narrative so that you can understand how the ulama operate in life, in society, in politics, in religion, and so forth. When we're talking about the Islamicate, and when we're talking about civilization or Islamic civilization, what does it mean in terms of the granular? Now, Muslims always want to talk about Islamic civilization because they have an inferiority complex and they want to show that we were great ones. We created soap and we did mathematics and we were traveling the world. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in, and Sumbul and I, we had this conversation before, is to embrace the violence. You can't say, for example, you can't make the argument that Muslims have not been violent. Of course they have. So you can't then say, well, Islam's a peaceful religion. You can make that argument. Muslims have still committed acts of violence. What you need to learn or come to terms with is that when Muslims committed these acts of violence, what were the mechanisms in the Islamicate which curtailed that violence? What were the mechanisms that softened and moved that violence out or phased it out? To some degree, when the West are saying that Daesh, for example, they're taking their ideas from Islam, they are taking their ideas from Islam. You can not then say they're not Muslim, they don't understand. That's a different argument. What you then need to do is show the complexity of the Islamicate of how Daesh have fallen off the table, right? But for them, to some degree, unfortunately, they have a very narrow understanding of what Islam is, and they've committed acts of violence. And that is part of our history. Our modern history, then, in the contemporary period, is not only all the wonderful things we want to promote. Things have happened, and we have to some degree as a community, take responsibility for that, rather than keep apologizing for it and saying it didn't happen, turn a blind eye, and so forth. What this means, then, is that we have to have a better intellectual understanding in that sense. So what it's understood for me, what you see in the Ottoman period, is the ulama understood modes of violence, that it was something that was within human beings. They understood the nature of jihad, that jihad is going to happen. We're going to go to war with people. In that context, they understood the hard punishment, that people are going to be punished for rules of whatever acts that they may have committed, capital punishment, for example. And the idea that you can just take that out of the Islamic component and feel embarrassed about it and it's not going to exist means that you're unable to look at the text and the terminology. You have to be brave enough to first embrace it, so that when you look at the text of Islam, you can start to understand what was happening. And I'm not trying to apologize for any of that in that sense. I'm trying to, as a historian, this is one of the things that I always get as students, that's not possible, Hojam. How can they do that, Hojam? That's not right, Hojam. But that's what happened. What do you want me to do now? You want me to say I'm not Muslim anymore? Right? But how can they do that, Hojam? And we have this from the beginning of Habil and Qabil. What are you talking about? It's the nature of human beings. You've been told by Allah Ta'ala continuously in this sense. So what I'm trying to explain to you is the ulama would have been part of a worldview where they would have understood that. And they need to exist as a way of trying to curtail that violence, to try to regulate that violence, to try to offset that violence. And so not only do you create culture to stop that, you have to be part of the process. And unfortunately, sometimes you can even be part of the violence, unfortunately. Okay, so in the 19th century, we start to see the emergence, as I said, of intellectual trends. Salafism is one of them. And Salafism is a very interesting intellectual trend. It's a response to multiple things. One of the responses it's to is the rising belief in scientism and positivism, Freemasonic lodges and so forth, right? So what they're starting to notice, for example, is that there is a dominance in an idea regarding rationality. And their inability to counter these rational arguments meant that they had to try to find a way of dealing with this and sometimes coexisting. So one of the interesting things I say this about whether it's your community or you're an intellectual group, when you are fighting against a greater force, okay, I'll give you an example. We're Muslim minorities in Britain. I'm from England, right? So this is the state, and this is us. And when you're fighting against the greater force, because it's stronger than you, after a time, you have to learn that it's the one that makes the rules, because it dominates over you. And then what you start to do is you accommodate those rules, and you start to, while you're fighting, still speak within the rules that they make. So you start to construct terms like Islamophobia, because they have xenophobia and anti-Semitism and so forth. So they've constructed the rules, you're trying to fight that, but that dominance is what dominates over you. And after time, when you're struggling for so long and they're grating away at you, you start to accommodate that. You are the one who makes the accommodation, the weaker party, not the stronger one. There is a compromise, but the greater compromise is always made by the weaker component here, not the greater one, right? So here what you start to see in Salafism, in particular at this moment in terms of reformist Salafism, the early Salafism, is the feeling that the West in particular, the reason why they're dominating over the Muslim world is because intellectually, in regards to the ideas of rationality, there's some form of superiority. Now they can't say that we're inferior, so they need to fight it with an alternative language, which is very similar. So you get civilizational discourse. Muslims didn't have civilizational discourse before this. But when the West was saying, we are civilization, we are Western civilization, the British civilization, the colonial civilization, when you start to see this civilizational discourse as a response to it, we also had a civilization. We Muslims have also been great, and so forth. Now this has stuck with us. We're still using these languages as a way of trying to make sense of ourselves. When in essence, you just need to say, I really don't care what you think. But they're not going to operate like that, right? So you start to see this. And so Salafism to some degree is trying to counter this movement rationally. That Islam is also rational. Islam also has rational thought within it. The jinn, yes, of course the jinn are bacteria, as Muhammad Abdul says. Why is he saying that? Because there's an uncomfortability to go to the Quran and say, maybe the jinn is something which the Quran says. No, it has to agree with my rationality. So you start to see this. Now, what's interesting is there's no form of uniformity regarding Salafism at this time because it's in its formative phase. So different ulama in the Arab provinces in particular would have understood Salafism in different ways. Jamal al-Qasimi would have been different than from al-Qawaqibi, for example. And Qawaqibi would have been different from Rashid Ridda. They had their different modes of understanding it. But what the printed press did is it allowed this intellectual movement to have a voice. And it allowed it to have a global voice. And it allowed it to speak on behalf of the Ummah. And so the Muslims were starting to internalize these ideas in that sense. But Salafism was not only a reaction to rationalism. Salafism was also a reaction to the Ottoman ulama's hierarchy system. Okay, certain members of the ulama who were part of the Ottoman administration had certain privileges. If you're a Hanafi Muftu, who's close to the Ottoman establishment in Damascus, if you're other members of the ulama, you feel marginalized by that. What you start to realize is the closer you are to power, the more privileges you can get from power. And most Salafists, to some degree, were outside the framework of power. So now not only are they critiquing in regards to rationalism, they're critiquing the idea of hierarchy itself. Then why do we need a hierarchy? Why do they need to tell us what Islam is? Why can we not just look at the text itself? Islam is not complicated. Open up the Quran, you can understand it. So they're pushing out this mantra. But what's even more interesting is while they are pushing out this mantra, there's a weird paradox. Because they're not saying you don't need hierarchy. They're just saying we are the authority. However, it's us who is the authority. Me, Muhammad Abdul, I'm the authority. So on the one hand, you're deconstructing the Ottoman legal system. You're deconstructing madahibs. You're deconstructing ilmiya and so forth. But on the other hand, you're now positing yourself by saying, we don't need this. You can read the Quran and Sunnah. And then when people read the Quran and Sunnah, goes, oh, Rasulullah says, you haven't quite understood it. Let me explain it to you. Right? So in actuality, you're not deconstructing the hierarchy. You're trying to replace an existing hierarchy with a new hierarchy. Right? In that sense. And so that's what you start to see in the Arab provinces. Salafism, interestingly enough, doesn't take off in Anatolia and the Balkans. There's a reason for that. The ilmiya system and structure is pretty strong. The ulama who graduate from the ilmiya system can be heavily entrenched in the Ottoman bureaucratic structure, which is a lot more loose in the Arab provinces, right, in that sense. But what you see is another movement. You see the emergence of a movement in Wahhabism in the Hijaz area. Now, Wahhabism is different from Salafism. It's also a reformist movement, by the way. But its reformism wants to go to what you call a puritanical version of Islam. That they didn't understand it properly. It needs to be purified. It's been contaminated. The Ottomans have been here for so long that we need a more simplified understanding of it. The Salafis were sympathetic towards the Wahhabis in many ways because the gripe was the same about the Ottoman center and encroachment of the West. But in in essence, ideologically, they were still a little bit different. The Wahhabi movement was restricted to the Hijaz in terms of the local customs and cultures and so forth, and in the way that they understood Islam regarding texts. Salafist movement was still far more enriched and had the scholars in the Azhar who could, as an institution, give them far more agency and platforms in that sense, right? So you have this. In Istanbul, you start to see the emergence of the Naqshbandi movement. So here you have another movement. Now, what I'm trying to explain to you, all of these movements present themselves as reformist movements in some shape or form. You can see there's what you could call like an intellectual kaleidoscope of different factions of Muslims, all pushing out. They're all members of the ulama in the way that they understand. What's interesting is what creates a uniformity is the ability to create a network community. Benedict Anderson, in his book Imagine Communities, talks about the idea of the printing press. He says, when you have a national identity, the national state has to have an official language. So in Turkey, it would be Turkce, right? As a result, all other languages would become secondary. And the national language is the most dominant language because it has a print, it has a visibility, and it's an official language of the state. Any language which is spoken but not written down loses its ability to exist because the national language is the dominant one. So he says that these languages created the imagination of belonging to a nation state, which is unprecedented in the past. But in the 19th century, what's even more interesting is, yes, he's correct in saying that, but where he missed the point was that the religious class, the ulama, were also able to create an imagination of a traditional idea of belonging. Because the ulama were journalists, the ulama were writers. So they were able to, on the one hand, you're able to write about the idea of belonging to a nation, but they were able to write belonging to the ummah. And the Muslim world in that sense is different from the rest of the world. This contestation. We already had what you would call collective identity that predates the nation state, beyond ethnicity and language. The sense of plurality that was there before the nation state and is still here after the nation state. That complexity of belonging to the ummah is a very unique configuration that other religious groupings do not have. Okay, they do not have that. And that's trying to make sense of that is the complexity here. So what I'm saying to you once again is this is a period of strange hybridization of what we're seeing here. And this is why I'm critical of people who talk about modernity in that very simplified form, because they don't understand. This could have gone either way. This could have gone like this or like this, okay, in that context. All right. So not only do we see the emergence of this, then what we start to see is a contestation over the institutions themselves, the madrasa systems, okay? Because via the madrasa system is where you educate people and how you educate them vis-a-vis Islam. So the ulama, in regards to the educational system, this becomes important to them. Okay? Now, what's interesting here then is that you're starting to see that this is a global phenomenon. Now, Amit Bain, in his book, makes the argument that in Istanbul there was a contestation between the conservative ulama and the reformist-minded ulama. That's a very narrow way of looking at it. What does that mean exactly? What I'm trying to indicate to you is actually they were all reform-minded, just in different ways, to different degrees, because you don't remain static. As the world is moving, you have to make the adjustment with it. So even those which you would call traditionalists are still reform-minded in the sense that they still want to make the adjustment and that adaptation to the world. So the idea that this is the reformist camp and this is the traditionalist camp is a reduction, okay? And this is not helpful in that sense. And one of the things that I was watching a video today, and they were asking Palestinians, the guy was asking them, are you Russia or Ukraine? Those are the two options. And they will say, we're with Russia. Why are you with Russia? Because the head of Ukraine, he's a Jew. Are you Russia or Ukraine? We're with Russia. Why? We're with Ukraine. Why? Because the Russians are occupying them, and we've been occupied. It was intriguing because both sides were given an argument, but the argument was binary for them. Are you this or that? And the problem when you do this or that, right? And this is the problem with what we call comparative history and comparative studies, comparing, the fascists in Europe to the rise of, the far right in Turkey. They're like this and like this. This doesn't help. Because actually, when you compare, you have to have not just the similar, maybe the same components. And we're not the same. So the comparison becomes difficult. This is why what we're encouraging, some of us like myself, is rather than looking at comparative studies, look at integrated studies. Integrative studies, right? Of looking at where they were similar, where they were different, where the commonalities, where the different, but they're integrated as well. Of course the Ottomans are integrated in the world they live in. Of course they are. Of course they're going to show signs of what's happening in the world. What we have done is we've gone the West versus the rest. That's how it is. Okay? One of the things I noticed in my own studies is how the Ottomans were interested in what's happening in other parts of the world. And you start to see a very different world. All right. So one of the things that we do see in this period is the emergence of a new intelligentsia. Okay? Nami Kamal, for example, is an example of this. These are people who are not ulama, but they are educated and they understand the ulama. So I give you myself as an example. I'm not an alim. I'm not going to take that credit. But when I was in London, when I was young, I used to do Jummah khutbas. I did Jummah khutbas, right? I teach in the ilahiyat, for example. Now, people who are not, if I went to Boazici, they'll say, oh, he's an ilahiyatchi. He's one of those. But in the ilahiyat, they know that I actually am not an ilahiyatchi. He's just an anomaly here. He's a person who listens to music, plays football, goes out, watches movies, but at the same time is very religious. How do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of me? What am I? Am I modern or am I traditional? Right? And that's a problem, like if you're trying to stick those labels on me. There are some people in the ilahiyat who think I'm exceptionally traditional, right? And there are other people who look at my clothes and say, how can he be traditional? Look at him. Right? And that's the point I'm making. Nami Kamal is one of these people. Mehmet Akif is one of these people. Akif is educated in veterinary school, but he's giving Jummah khutbas at Ayah Sophia, and he's doing Quran tafsir. How do you make sense of that? What you're starting to see is the emergence of a new intelligentsia in the sense that the new printing culture that's coming from Europe, not only in terms of text, but in terms of ideas, is facilitating the need to try to counter that with a new group of thinkers. But these new group of thinkers are not critiquing the ulama. I'm not anti-ulama. I've always been pro. Okay, so I'm not going to say I'm an intellectual, because I'm not. But as a person who's educated, anyone who knows me knows that I am very pro-ulama, because I believe the absence of the ulama in any Muslim community is to the detriment of that community. I'm very pro. Many of my teachers were ulama who taught me how to be a good human being. I will never forget that. I will never forget that. So I work with them as a thinker, and I bring ideas to them. And when I was in Malaysia, and a girl was asking a question on feminism, and the alim gave the answer, and I said, no, and I pulled him to the side. I said, she's speaking about third wave feminism. He goes, what's that? I'll speak to you about this later. You're still stuck on second wave feminism, right? And because they need people who are still in the system to help him out. How would he know, right, in that context? But that's not his fault. But what we saw is that these intellectuals were working with the ulama, but also having the language to be able to critique the ulama. I'm one of those people. I critiqued them. When the war in Syria happened, I was very vocal. I've backed down a bit more now that time has gone by and I've got older. I've become a lot more sympathetic towards the challenges of violence and the way that exit came out. But at the time, I was very vocal, critiquing them for not saying anything, for not doing anything. It's only now I realize that maybe I was mistaken, and maybe I should have used a different way of saying things. So what you start to see in this sense then is this new educated elite of what Ismail Qara calls. He says the emergence of these new intellectual elites created the intellectualization of the ulama. Mustafa Sabri is an example of this. Sabri is a journalist, he's a parliamentarian, in that sense. He's a Sheikh al-Islam, he's a graduate from Fateh Madrasa, but he's an intellectual. I don't think he could read Immanuel Kant, but I think people could read Kant to him. I said, which is sufficient, yani. Okay, maybe he should have known the original language. But Hamdi Yazar could read it. Hamdi Yazar knew French. So he's an intellectual. The problem we have is how do we describe the word intellectual? We've internalized the idea that to be an intellectual is to be secular. Okay? What's interesting is prior to the modern period, when we speak about intellectualism or intellectual discourse in Islam, we think of the ulama. The minute we get to the modern period, we don't think of them. We throw them out of this intellectual framework in this sense. And this is another thing I want you to start thinking about. So what we see in the Ottoman domains is these contestations, right? And these challenges in this sense. One of the interesting things that we also start to see, which is similar amongst all these intellectual trends, is the need to hold authority to account. the accountability of authority. It becomes the zeitgeist of the world at the time, the trend in the world. No matter what country you're in, the idea is that there's corruption, there's abuse of power, it's authoritarianism. We need a way of curtailing that, whether it was local or whether it was right at the top, whether it was the tax collector or the Padishah himself. So constitutionalism as a concept started to become a dominant idea across the board. Now what's interesting is Islam already has ideas of holding leaders to account. So that's not unique in the Ottoman context, the idea of holding the bay'ah in and of itself is a condition, it's a contract to hold the leader to account. It's already intrinsic within Islamic discourse. The authority belongs to the ummah as a concept. It's already an idea of holding the leader to account. The implementation of the Sharia, and if he doesn't, blah, 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 so forth, right? What the Ottomans are doing in this period, however, just like the rest of the world, as the world is becoming more literate and as states are becoming more bureaucratic, is we now need to create a document. Okay? But constitutional documents, you've got to understand, are not restrictive. There's a vagueness always in language. Language is always vague so that both sides can still have room to maneuver and play with. So in that sense, people seem to assume that the creation of the constitutions are a way of modernizing to be like the West. But if you look at the Ottoman constitution, it's still very different than what they were doing in the West. Very different. Because Islam is different. The language of Islam is different in that sense. And so it's only natural that its construction of the constitutions are going to be different. If you look at any of the constitutions prior to World War I, the discussion is about having an imperial authority, an imperial power. Okay? So 61 in Tunisia, the Egyptian one that doesn't survive in the 1880s, the Ottoman Constitution of 76 and then 1908, the Afghan Constitution of the 1920s, the Syrian Constitution of 1921, the Iranian Constitution of 1906, the Russian Constitution of 1905, the Meiji Restoration, the Qing Constitution, they're all talking about maintaining the role of religion, not that religion is under the state, but religion is part of the state, and that we have an imperial authority in power. They did not want nation state. They wanted to maintain the imperial structure in terms of what they had. It's after World War I and World War II, if you see then the Egyptian constitution, the Pakistani constitution, or Pakistani constitution is quite unique actually, it's a bit of an exception. But the constitutions in the Arab world in particular, you see a shift in language, and a shift in the role of Islam, and a shift in consolidating nation state. Why? Because there's a particular form of violence, of colonialism, which shapes the nation state. And in actuality, the violence that you see in the Arab world today is a violence of colonialism. It's post-colonial violence. It's not Ottoman violence at all, in any shape or form. When the colonial powers were trying to force the Arabs to submit and use aggressive forms of violence, when they became independent, they left state structures where the people internalized that violence and learned how to be violent amongst themselves, learning from the colonial powers. That was the only way those states would survive. Egypt is an example, Syria, Iraq, and so on, right? In that sense. So this is an important point. Why am I making this point? The reason why I'm making this point is about the Turkish Republic. Because when the Turkish Republic is formed and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, what you start to see is the Turkish Republic had a specific program of self-colonialism as a way of removing the ulama from the state structure to try to be as modern as everyone else. What you see in that sense, and we'll talk about the Arab provinces in a second, because the Arab world went through a different form of violence, the Arab world went through an exterior form of violence. And because the Arabs are resistant, they maintain a bit more agency for the ulama, because the power is foreign. When the power is foreign, you try to fight it. Okay, you're bending, but you're trying to fight it. But when the power is internal, then it's totally different, right? So one of the things that we see in the creation of the Turkish Republic in 1922 is for the first time making the case that the caliph, or the constitution of 21 is nominal, and the authority belongs to the parliament itself. The idea of authority belongs to the ummah went into the hands of the parliament directly, diminishing the role of the khalifa. But in 1924, when the Ottoman state officially collapses in 22, but when in 24 the position of the khalifa is abolished, the Sheikh al-Islam is also taken out of the cabinet. Okay? The Nizamiya courts and the Sharia courts are closed down. Now, the point I'm trying to make to you here is this is the closing down of the ulama, some salami slicing taking place gradually, as we see it, right? Okay, 1925, they closed down the tekkes and the turbes. And then they banned the turban and the fez. Once again, it's really intriguing. This form of intervention is unparalleled. It hasn't happened before. Only the nation state has the capacity to do that. Under the law on the maintenance and order, this is Eric Jan Zurcher's account, 7,500 people were arrested on the basis that they were refusing to take off their hats. 660 people were executed. Okay? So imagine today, I mean, if Sisi was doing that in Egypt, we'd go crazy. So understand, hey, this is unprecedented. If I told you that there was a government around the world that was telling you, you can't wear trousers, you have to wear jeans. And if you don't, we're going to put you in prison. You go crazy. So it's clothing. What's it got to do with you? But this is happening here. So this sort of like stripping down. Now, who's being stripped down? It's the ulama. It's the ulama's authority. When we're talking about tekkes, when we're talking about the hats, when we're talking about the office of the Shaykh al-Islam, when we're talking about the removal of parliament, when we're talking about the closing of the Nizamiya courts, the Sharia courts, this is gradually the Turkish Republic deciding that we are going to modernize in this manner. Okay? Now, what's interesting afterwards is, even more interesting is in 1932, you have the language reform and the alphabet reform. The language reform is to purge any of those words which sound Islamicate. And we're going to replace them with Turkic words. So any words that are predominantly Farsi or Arabic, they need to go. And so people started sending in words that were Turkic as a way of trying to deal with this problem. This was a huge problem because if you look at, I said this before, if you look at the Ottoman dictionary, the biggest section in the Ottoman dictionary is mim, ma. Okay? There is not a word in Turkish with ma. There isn't one. Every single word with ma is foreign. Muhtashim, Mustafa, Mehmed, Merve, Mukammil, blah, blah, blah. They're all Farsi or Arabic. Apart from geldin mi. And that's the only time they have ma. And that's, in of itself an evolution. Because in other parts, if you go to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, they use the word ga instead of ma in that sense, right? So what's intriguing here is the biggest section in the Ottoman dictionary is ma. And the second biggest section in the Ottoman dictionary is alif. Because these are constructions of the wazn system, right? I said before, like inkilab is an Ottoman construction of an Arabic wazn system. Kalaba, there's a word for that, but inkilab, there was no word for that. The Ottomans created that word, inkilab, because the word thawra, or what did they use? Ihtimal. I think they used ihtimal, I'm not sure, was pejorative. You see this in the work of Ruhi al-Khalidi. Ruhi al-Khalidi is the grandfather of Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian academic in America. And he writes in his book, he says, this is not a thawra, this is an inkilab. And people, inkilab ne demek yani. It's a transformation. It's not a revolution, okay, in this sense. Why? Because imagine doing a revolution against the Padishah. It's unthinkable, okay? So you have to say it's a transformation. It's only after World War I, when the Turkish Republic was formed, they called it an inkilab, revolution. And then you start to say, Gaddafi and the Zengas and Dardars and inkilab. You then start to see it later, and then in Pakistan and so forth. But prior to that, this was not the word. What we start to see then, is important for you to understand, is the evolution of language. That words can have one meaning at one period of history, and then they change in another moment of history. For example, let me think of a word that's changed. The word devlet has changed. Today, the devlet means the modern nation state. In the Ottoman period, it doesn't mean that. Devlet meant something totally different. Istibdad. Istibdad became a negative word in the late 19th, early 20th century. Prior to that, the Muslims only understood istibdad. They didn't have another word. So authoritarianism was like, adi, that's what we do. But later on, it was like, you can't have power all in one hand. Yeah, in this context. I was listening to a talk by Sheikh Bhuti the other day, and it was interesting because he said the word baghi, rebellion in Islam, he goes, when we use it in fiqh, we don't use it negatively. It has a neutral term. And he was making the argument that baghi, the word baghi, to rebel against, he was using the argument of Muawiyah's rebellion against Imam Ali. And he said, Ali is a Khalifa, so he has a particular reason of why he's Khalifa. Muawiyah rejects it, and he rejects it by saying that he has an Islamic reason for it. Now, what Sheikh Buti says is that we later might say that they were wrong, but at the time, the argument they're making is they have a Sharia reason. As a result, when they were using the word baghi at the time, he said it's a neutral term. It's only now we're starting to see it's a pejorative term. Now, what's he doing is quite intriguing, because when he was using that term regarding the Syrian revolution, he's already set them up before. I'm saying the word baghi, but I don't mean it's negative. But I have to use this word because the state wants me to use it. But understand, historically, that it's a neutral term. So I'm using it. And this is how language operates. And so what he's doing is he's playing with words and language here, right? It's intriguing that how language and words work. Allahu Akbar. So one of the things you see then is, then we see the secularization of the family law. Okay? We then see the abolishment of religious marriages and the abolishment of polygamy. So the state is going through every single aspect of the Ottoman society, closing of the madrasas, closing of all the institutions. And the nutuk speech in actuality is a vindication. It's a vindication aimed directly at the ulama, in that sense. Legitimizing the sort of like, what you could call creation of the Turkish Republic. This is very unique in this context. So in this sense, what you see in the Turkish Republic is very unique in terms of what's happened. What we've seen is that the Republic has decided that the ulama are too intrinsically ingrained in every aspect of the configuration of this Islamicate empire. And in order for us to modernize, we need to uproot them from every aspect of this Islamicate empire. And in a sense, to be modern, we really need to make Islam a religion. And the way that we do that is the practitioners of that religion. We need to try to marginalize their authority. And the only way that their authority can be marginalized is to strip them away of everything that they are. So you understand how deeply rooted the ulama were in Ottoman society. So to make the argument that the ulama were facilitating this modernization is a little bit not helpful, because they were the biggest victims of this modernization in some degree. So what the ulama were attempting to do, I would argue, in the late Ottoman period, is they're trying to make the adjustment as the world is moving along, but they're also consolidating themselves in the machinery so that the machinery still has that Islamic component. It doesn't lose that identity, right? And this is quite unique in this sense. In the Arab provinces, something else happens. In Bilad al-Sham, you have the French occupation. And as a result of the French occupation, the language of Islam became important and necessary as a way of fighting the French occupation. And as a result of that, the ulama became important, okay, because of that sense of resistance, right? The British occupation, the occupation of Palestine, for example, and so on. In Iraq, there's another complexity, because you have Sunni and Shia members of the ulama. And now the complexity they have is, before there was a fluidity between the ulama of Baghdad and Karbala and Najaf, between Iran and Iraq in the Ottoman period, and now that's gone. Muhammad Husseini al-Naini, al-Najafi, he makes the argument during World War I that he was a water carrier in World War I for the Ottoman army. And he was making the argument that not to vote during these elections, because these elections are haram. That it's better for the Shia to live under the authority of a Sunni caliph than to live under a nation-state of Iraq that has been facilitated by the British. And that's intriguing to see that. What I'm trying to explain to you is how quickly the world is changing for them so fast. And what you're seeing is the complexity then of ideological trends. As I said, different ideological trends. You're seeing different generational trends. You're seeing technological shifts. You're seeing a world changing so fast because of warfare. You're seeing many members of the ulama dying or being killed in the war, and so on. And so it changes rapidly. And you're seeing then the state machineries themselves going after the ulama establishment in that context. And so as a result, World War II consolidates that, and it totally changes everything. My argument is, and I'll make this argument quite clearly, is that our imagination of the ulama and our imagination of the Ottoman ulama is a post-World War II imagination. It doesn't take into consideration this complexity of empire, this complexity of plurality, this complexity of networks. Imagine on the one hand, you're an Ottoman alim who has access to the whole of the Ottoman domains, and then you're just stuck in Palestine. You can't go anywhere. You have borders all of a sudden. Imagine in that context, you're in 1 minute you can be in Iraq and Iran, and that's why I said his name is Muhammad Hussein al-Naini, meaning he was born in Nain. And what's interesting about Naini is he wrote the ideas of the Iranian constitution in 1906. And Naini was using Baghdad as a way of positing ideas of constitutionalism in Iran. But in the Ottoman documents, he's called al-Naini al-Najafi, because he lived in Najaf. And he had a sense of belonging to both Iran and the Ottoman domains, and a sense of otherization in the sense of Iran and the Ottoman domains. Now, he wasn't a migrant in the sense of a war. He was a migrant out of choice because of education. He wanted to be educated and went to another city. And he started to subscribe to that identity. For me, for example, I've moved to Turkey. I live here. To some degree, I've started to subscribe to certain Turkish traits and ideas and identity. When I go back to England and people I criticize Turkey here. I'm saying it on camera, on this as well. But when I go to London and people criticize Turkey, I say, hang on a minute, what are you talking about? What do you know? You don't live there. What are you talking about? It's strange because now I feel like an insider, in that sense. And this is how identity works. You start to, I was watching a show in Japan where a woman, she wants to be a samurai. So a lot of people in America are writing to her that you're culturally appropriating, shame on you, woke, this, that, the other. But the Japanese will say, no, it's good, you're trying to be Japanese. You're trying to be like one of us. I remember when I went to Malaysia, and I wore the Malaysian clothing with the hat, and I had some Muslim friends of England go, oh, why are you appropriating Malay culture? I said, am I appropriating Malay culture? I'm Muslim. Is it possible for a Muslim to appropriate another Muslim culture? Is that possible? When I went on the Hajj, I wore the jilab. And when I go to Pakistan, I wore the shalwar kameez. And if I go to Africa, I'll do the same. Because I'm Muslim, because I want to identify as being Muslim. Is it wrong that Syrian women come to Istanbul, they're wearing white hijabs, and now they're wearing hijabs to look like Turkish women? Is that so wrong? It is what it is. What I'm saying is that in terms of the Islamicate, we have to be a little bit careful in the way that we identify, right? So in that sense, one of the points I was trying to make is they had these networks. They were intermeshed. And then when World War I happens, it's collapsed, and then you have the clear demarcation. So what I'm trying to help you understand, I guess, is to understand the role of the ulama within this period of modernity. Okay, I don't want to position the ulama as pro-modernity, anti-modernity. I just want you to understand that the ulama who always exist have to continuously deal with the changing times. That's what's expected from them. They're scholars in that sense. And their job is to continuously to give advice to society. I'm going to give you one last piece of advice before I open up to Q&A. Okay, Ramadan is coming. Okay, I really do hope that you make the most of this month. This is the month where you get the opportunity to go close to Allah. This is the month in which you extend your salah to be close to Him. Okay, in that sense. And Allah Ta'ala makes you pray 5 times a day so that you continuously remember Him, that you are close to Him. Rasulullah used to pray tahajjud at night. He didn't need to pray tahajjud at night. But when he would tell his wives that, I went on the Miraj, if you saw what I saw, you would be praying tahajjud every day at night. In that context, recognizing that he's Abdullah, the idea of submitting to Allah. Ramadan is the month of salah. That's why we do taraweeh. That's why we do tahajjud. That's why we improve our salah 5 times a day. Ramadan is the month for fasting. It's not the month of not eating in a day and then eating at iftar time. It's the idea of increasing your taqwa. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran that to get close to Him in taqwa, fast more. Okay? So we fast because we're aware that anything can break our fast. It increases our taqwa. We're remembering Him. Ramadan is the month of the Quran. It's the month of the word of your Lord. Ramadan is the month of Laylatul Qadr. Okay? And we don't know because it can fall in any one of the last 10 days. In that sense, Allah Ta'ala has given you so many opportunities to be close to Him. I know you don't want to hear this lecture from me right now. And you came to listen to this. But the problem I'm having is, with this generation in particular, everyone wants to talk about Islamic feminism, Islamic Kemalism, and so forth. And you're not doing the basics. your understanding of your relationship with your Lord, your understanding your ruh, the understanding of your ibadah, why you're here, why you're fasting. In this month of Ramadan, please, don't do any talks on Islam and feminism, and Islam and liberalism, and so forth. Go to the masjid. Listen to the Quran. Listen to the words of Allah. Go pray salah, and get closer to Him, and wake up for tahajjud, and pray Quran together. And if you're married, pray with your wife. Pray with your children, so that they have an understanding from their spirit that they are Muslim. In this context, I can't stress this enough to you, because I feel like you keep inviting speakers who are the same age as you. And so you're speaking about things that are on Twitter when you should be listening to people who are ulama, who are talking about these things. Invite people who can teach you Quran. Invite people who can teach you hadith. Invite people who will teach you aqidah. Invite people that will tell you how to be a good human being. That's why you need ulama. That's why I studied this. I wish I still have this. I wish I had it. I don't. It feels sad for me in that context. I want you to have these type of discussions. Invite people to help increase your taqwa and your tawakkul and so forth, right? This is what the ulama did. And if we don't have them, then be them. Be like that, okay? So my apologies for that little rant in that sense, but I really pray to Allah Ta'ala that you use this month as a way of getting close to Him. I got annoyed at some of my students who were asking me that they may not have to fast in the month of Ramadan because they have exams. I said, are you kidding me? Seriously? What are you doing? You're breaking my heart. Don't say these things. What you should be doing is trying to get close to your Lord in this month. And to make Him happy, you will go through all the walls you need to go through, because we may not get this month again. It's next week, inshallah. May Allah Ta'ala give us the opportunity to see the month of Ramadan, and may He give us the opportunity to see through the month of Ramadan in that context. Thank you very much for sticking by for these last 4 weeks. If I've ever said anything to any of you to offend you in that shape or form, I apologize. If I've said anything offensive towards this great nation and their leadership, then I apologize for that too.